itself all right by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me, though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
World War II changed the world forever, and forever after. The Fagan Fighters World War II Museum of Granite Falls, Minnesota was created as a tribute to the men and women of the greatest generation, whose incredible sacrifices during World War II won and preserved the freedoms we enjoy today. The Fagan Fighters World War II Museum is the dream, the creation, and the passion of the Fagan family of Granite Falls, Minnesota, Ron and Diane Fagan and their sons Aaron and Evan.
We've taken on a mission to connect the latest generation with the greatest generation, because these are events in our history that need to be remembered, and in our case, and in the case of young children, they need to be introduced to. And we feel they're very important and need to be preserved, and that's what we're trying to do.
The mission is to preserve the memory of the heroes of World War II, promote patriotism in today's Americans, and inspire tomorrow's leaders to study and apply history's lessons. It's not enough that these beautiful airplanes are collected and restored. The Fagan Museum restores each of them to flying condition.
I think with everything at the museum, having stuff operational is important because people get to see them, how they were used, and get to hear them start up, and it gives people a better perspective of what these machines were capable of and what they look like in the air.
There are no markers, monuments, or visitor centers in the skies above Europe, the Pacific, or the China, Burma, India theaters of World War II. These airplanes are the monuments. They are timeless portals to the courage and deeds of those who gave their all to preserve all that we hold dear. When the museum's airplanes are not flying, they are displayed in 3 hangars: the trainer hangar, the fighter hangar, and the bomber hangar.
World War II was a worldwide conflict, and unfortunately it's not being taught in our schools anymore. But history always has a tendency to repeat itself, so we got to educate the younger generations about World War II. So learn these experiences from the past so you can apply them in the future to help guide this country in the right direction.
I know the buildings are built to last 250 years. The stories that are contained within these buildings will last just as long. We're connecting some of the battles. The only thing we can connect them with are the ground machines, which many people have a connection to rather than the aircraft.
With the museum opening, I started looking into the military vehicles. Started with the Deuce and a Half. The ambulance, when I had that repainted, we made sure that it matched the 4th Medical Battalion. And the 4th Medical Battalion actually were the first ambulances to arrive on D-Day. The ground vehicles all operate fully functional, and we could start them all up and take off and drive them right now.
The Fagan Fighters World War II Museum doesn't just tell the story of what happened. It is dedicated to preserving the stories of those who lived it, telling us how it happened. Veterans and others are invited to the museum to share their stories firsthand. Their stories are recorded and preserved through the museum's Voices of Valor program.
Let's do our museum around my father, Ray Fagan, and his World War II experiences. The first campaign medal he got was Normandy invasion. Second campaign medal he got was Liberation of Paris. And the third campaign medal he got was the Battle of the Bulge. He said you can't imagine how terrible it was.
We decided to make our collection a real museum when people referred to it as such. We opened the museum doors directly after our air show in 2012, so the date was June 17th, 2012.
The Fagan Fighters World War II Museum puts its collection in context for visitors by using original murals, sculptures, paintings, photographic collections, and other fine art to tell the story of epic events such as D-Day, June 6, 1944. This rail car, which anchors the museum's Holocaust exhibit, was found after years of searching in Germany and brought here so that no generation will ever forget the horror of the Holocaust or the memories of those who were lost.
When the Germans marched in, I was 7 years old. When I was liberated in January 18, 1945, I was 8 years old. And these are some of the things I remember.
The best single teacher we have about the lessons of the Holocaust are survivors. And for years, they've been the most important teachers. Sadly, as historian Deborah Lipstadt would say, the tyranny of biology means we have fewer and fewer survivors to speak. Memorials, and that's almost too static a term, opportunities to learn, like this exhibit, which opens people's eyes to the horrors of the Holocaust, are becoming ever more important in the absence of survivors. So what the Fagans have done here with their exhibit is to create a wonderful, remarkable learning opportunity for people of southwestern Minnesota, entire state, upper Midwest, and I know people coming from all over the world in learning about the Holocaust through this specific lens. So we thank the Fagans for their generosity of spirit, their vision, and their commitment to Holocaust education as they teach about the Second World War.
We're very happy to call the JCRC friends. They have visited the museum a number of times. Were very helpful in our Holocaust exhibit when we were building that at Split Rock Studios. And we are thrilled to be the recipient of their yearly award.
Someday, sooner than we'd like, the headline will read, "Last World War II Veteran Dies." When that day comes, how will we connect the greatest generation with the latest generation? Restoring these things to their original power and function, and capturing the stories of those members of the greatest generation who are still with us, offers not only a portal to the past, but an immortal connection to America's future generations.
Adolf Hitler, the Führer, dictator of Nazi Germany, along with Mao and Stalin, one of the most evil killer leaders of the 20th century. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. The treaty stripped defeated Germany of territory, of weapons, and what was left of its economy. Hitler was provoked to write his book, Mein Kampf, in English, My Struggle, where he laid out his plan for a new world order. His Nazi party would restore Germany and take over Europe. In fiery speeches, day and night, to thousands, he preached two great evils, Judaism and communism. Over 6 years, Hitler built an overwhelmingly powerful and tactically brilliant military force, ground, sea, and air. He took over Austria and Czechoslovakia, then in 1939 invaded Poland. Within 3 months, he crushed 6 countries, controlled most of Western Europe, and was knocking on France's door. In the spring of 1940, the Germans surrounded nearly 340,000, mostly British and French, troops. Their only escape was from the shore of the port of Dunkirk in northwestern France. The water was extremely shallow, so British destroyers could not approach the beaches without running aground. Well, Prime Minister Winston Churchill mobilized every possible private boat, over 700 of them, to cross the English Channel from Ramsgate in eastern Britain to the rescue. Pleasure boats, yachts, fishing boats, any boat with a shallow draft to navigate the shallow water and ferry troops out to the waiting ships, or sail them back to England. Over 10 days that spring, they became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk and saved more than 338,000 British and French troops to fight another day. And that day came very soon when the Germans began what became known as the Blitz, nearly 10 months of bombing Britain day and night, the Battle of Britain. Churchill, in one of his powerful radio talks, rallied his country.
These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plan. He has lighted a fire which will burn with a steady and consuming flame until the last vestiges of Nazi tyranny have been burnt out of Europe.
Heroes of the Blitz were 2 airplanes, the Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, and, of course, their pilots. They destroyed more than 2,600 German aircraft. Britain survived the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, but knew that new and more versatile aircraft were desperately needed to outlast and outgun Nazi Germany. The de Havilland Mosquito filled the bill. It was actually made of wood, the frame and the outer skin, so it was nicknamed the Timber Terror, the Loping Lumber Yard, and the Wooden Wonder. 6,700 were built during World War II. With a crew of 2, it was a day-night fighter-bomber and photo reconnaissance aircraft, and very effective as a low-altitude intruder. It was the most versatile twin-engine plane of World War II. And it was the first twin-engine airplane ever landed on an aircraft carrier. The pilot was Eric Brown, call sign Winkle. He was Britain's most decorated pilot. He flew 487 different types of aircraft and performed more carrier landings than any pilot in history, 2,271. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Warren Denholm and Stu Dawson and Sam Bass, my partner in crime out here. Either one. Sam, you at the other end? Yeah, the bookend was Sam there. That's good. Gentlemen, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Why was this plane needed as the war wound down?
Well, it's one of the most high-performance airplanes out there, and it's got the power and the versatility and the firepower to do just about anything that they needed to do.
But the fact that it's made of wood, how curious is that or not?
Warren, I think you can answer that since you built the airplane.
That's why we're only going to get two of those. Well, the airplane was built by de Havilland in England. So de Havilland had been working on a plywood composite sandwich construction for a few years before the war broke out. And they had this idea that to meet a specification that the British military had put out for a high-speed bomber, that if they could build it out of the smooth plywood construction, they could achieve the performance parameters they were looking for, and they could offer something that wasn't made out of aluminium anymore, and aluminium was going to become a very strategic product during the war because all the other aircraft manufacturers were pushing aluminium airplanes. And de Havilland could see that that was going to be a difficult product to get hold of, so they went for the wooden construction.
So what were the pluses and minuses? What was gained by its being made of wood, and what was given up, if anything, by its having been made of wood?
Well, part of the other concept that they had was that since the war had broken out, the King of England wasn't buying any fine furniture anymore, and there were a whole lot of little furniture manufacturers and piano makers and all these little businesses around England with a skill set of cabinet makers that were their abilities were no longer required, and so they developed the design in such a way that they could kind of move all different products to these little shops around the country. They could have the horizontal built in one town with one little company, and then bring it all together at the end. So that would sort of diversify the manufacture, utilise the skill set of these people that were otherwise not needed, and also make the airplane much quicker to build because you don't need a lot of a wooden airplane. Obviously, you have to have the basic skills, but most wooden components just start off as a drawing on a set of plans, and with rudimentary tools, you can kind of make anything. So it doesn't require a whole lot of heavy metal and dyes and special equipment that you would normally need for an aluminium airplane that has to go into a proper production facility. So it was quite a clever way of doing it. What did it give up? Well,
in terms of performance, I mean, yeah.
Oh, in terms of performance, well, I don't think it gave up anything. It's not necessarily lighter than an aluminium airplane, but it is definitely smoother. It has less number of components for any given sort of piece of construction. It's as monocoque as you could get. It only has 7 bulkheads down the length of the fuselage, and in a lot of other airplanes, you can't even get out of the cockpit and you've had 7 bulkheads. It's probably not as robust from a weathering perspective. You can't leave it outside without it suffering a little bit, but No, it didn't give anything up in performance.
What's it like to fly, Stuart? Stu?
It's a little different than the aircraft that we're used to, but just systems and stuff and everything. And he's talking about performance. This thing, a Mustang has a hard time staying with it. I have to pull back on power so they can stay with me at cruise power. So it's slick. It goes through the air real well. This is a little bit bigger than a fighter, but it's a fighter. It can be. It can be a bomber. It's very versatile. You can't be a real big guy and fly because there's not much room in it, but it is a fantastic airplane.
And one person in the cockpit?
Well, usually they carry two. There's usually two seats up there, the pilot and the navigator, i.e. bomb.
Yep.
There's a bomb sight out front that he could put out and look for the bombs and everything, but it's so versatile and it will go.
To what extent can it bite you?
Say again?
To what extent can this airplane bite you when you don't expect it to?
There's a lot of stories about how the VMC on this airplane.
What's that mean?
VMC is the speed at which you don't have enough rudder to control the airplane with one engine inoperative, basically. And it's out there. There's a number out there. Everybody says 160, but unless you're fully loaded, with bombs and all the ammo and everything, real high gross weight, this thing doesn't have a problem at all. It'll fly at 140. You just pull the power back a little bit so you don't have so much torque. It's not as dangerous as people say it was. It's really, but the way we were flying them in World War II, any of these airplanes were overgrossed and it was a different animal. Yeah. It's a great airplane.
So, where is this airplane from? This airplane. Tell us where it's from, how you found it, what you did with it.
Yeah. Well, this airplane was a Hatfield-built airplane from the UK. So they built Mosquitoes in England, Canada, and Australia. But by far the bulk of them were built in England. So this one was built at Hatfield in England and delivered in March 1945. So almost at the end of the hostilities, and it was delivered to an operational training unit that was training pilots for strike operations and long-range fighter missions. And it stayed with the operational training unit until the war ended, and then after the war ended, it was sent off to maintenance units for whatever they did at maintenance units after the war, practice polishing them or something, I don't know. It didn't really do anything much else. And then in 1948, the RNZAF in New Zealand, only coincidentally, bought or was sold from the British government a few more than 80 Mosquitoes. So England didn't really want the Mosquito after the war. The new jet airplanes like the Vampire and the Meteor and what have you were coming on stream. The Mosquito was kind of outdated. It had sort of paved the way for multi-engine, universals type airplanes that could do fighting and bombing. But it soon got superseded by the jet. Anyway, they got rid of 80 of them, flew them down to New Zealand and started flying them in 1948 to New Zealand. Most of them made it. And the ones that got to New Zealand, the RNZAF only used 20 of them. They had 60 spares. So we think that this one we can't find any evidence that it actually was one of the operational airplanes with the RNZAF, but it definitely arrived in New Zealand. And it may have gone into storage with a whole lot of others. And then in 1952 or 3, I can't remember exactly which one it was, the government stores board in New Zealand decided that the Mosquito for them was finished as well, and they were being replaced with jets, and they auctioned them off. And a company from California bought 6 of these Mosquitoes for aerial survey work in California. They prepped this aeroplane at Palmerston North in New Zealand for the ferry flight up to California. registered it on the civil register in New Zealand, and then the day it left, they registered it with the FAA and took off heading for California. So they sort of island hopped their way up and finally got to Hawaii. It took 11 days, I think, in total to fly up to the US. And in that period, that 11-day period, word had got out that a private company in Southern California was importing these aeroplanes, and the government got involved and halted any further shipment of them because they were fearful that they would end up in South American hands for covert operations. So the rest of the airplanes...
As in American intelligence?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I think
the
that's...
company.
Yeah, if you can say American intelligence in the same sentence. But I'm only kidding.
Ooh, take that.
Anyway.
Well, partly you were kidding. I know. Okay, all right.
So it was the only one to make it. It operated in California for a little while, but then unfortunately the company that, fortunately maybe, the company that was operating them got involved in an insurance scam. They had another B-35 airplane, and the owner was struggling financially, and he cooked up an arrangement with this pilot whereby the guy would fake that he had an engine problem and fly out over the coast of California there and jump out and let the airplane go into the sea, and they would be able to claim the insurance. But whether it was deliberate or not, the airplane suffered an actual problem, not a fake problem, and it crashed in the hills at the back of California, back of Los Angeles, and killed the pilot. Well, in the short term, he got paid out, but in the long term, he got found out that perhaps he was responsible for the reason the aeroplane had crashed, and he ended up in jail. But this aeroplane, which was sort of collateral for the loans and what have you, ended up being impounded by the insurance company that had paid the money out. And it got parked at Whiteman Field in Burbank and just basically left there for the next 25 years. It wasn't being, well, they weren't paying any ground rent, and it just became more and more dilapidated as time went by. Sitting out on the edge of the... outside on the edge of the field. There were a number of other airplanes. I don't know about this airfield, but it seemed like a bit of a dumping ground for old airplanes back then. And right up until the 70s, it was just that became more and more derelict, more and more pieces stolen off it by souvenir hunters, and kids would go and play on it. And it became quite a sorry sight. And then there was a plan to take it to Ed Maloney knew about it, and there was a plan Ed had hatched to take the airplane to his museum, but for one reason or another that never happened. And the guy Jim Merizon, who was an A4 pilot for the Navy, he saw it. He'd fallen in love with the Mosquito and decided that somebody needed to save this airplane and rebuild it. And so in 1971 he went out with a big low loader and loaded all the remains of this terrible looking aeroplane onto it. And
did he buy it? He bought it?
Yeah, I think he bought it off the airport company, who had taken ownership of it in lieu of unpaid parking fees for the last 20-odd years. I don't actually know what he paid for it.
Any idea what he paid for it?
I'd like to know what he paid for it, but he probably won't tell me. So then it was more or less saved, I suppose, from the ravages. He stored it with lots of plans of eventually rebuilding it. But like a lot of these, ideas and people that do these wonderful things back in the time when there was no industry like this, it was a great idea, but he didn't have the resources that needed to do it. Although he definitely had the desire, and but he'd done the critical thing in that he'd saved it. He got it inside, mostly, so began its sort of rebirth.
And what year was that?
So that was in 1971, and he managed to hang on to it until 2014, when so he had it for a long time, and it wasn't easy to get it off him. He did not really want to let it go, and it took quite a bit of convincing that
who did the convincing?
Well, Simon Brown was heavily involved in bringing Jim and myself together, and we kind of you had to impress upon them that there was that a lot of these projects are all about timing, and that the timing was right for his aeroplane. There was somebody that wanted to rebuild it who had the money to do it. There was a company like ours that had the ability to do it, and there was his project that could be the start of it all. So these things only come together. Not that often. There's a lot of people with projects and a lot of places that can do them, and a few people with the money. But
timing.
You got to get them all on the same page or in the same bar at the same time.
Right.
Anyway, he finally relented, and almost with a tear in his eye, saw it disappear into a container on its way down to New Zealand.
Does this have a public cost at this point? Does anybody know what was paid for it?
Does anybody know?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The guy that paid for it knows, but he's not here.
But do you know what it was, the cost?
Yeah, but he asked me not to tell you.
Oh, well, okay, we covered that. So what happened to it? Where was it shipped?
One of the most amazing things about this aeroplane that doesn't happen very often with World War II relics is that its original engines were still with it.
Yeah.
So in spite of the fact that a whole lot of cool stuff had been souvenired over the preceding 70 years, the engines on their engine mounts, still with their exhausts and cowlings and everything.
Cowling and the spinners.
Everything
is original.
It was all still there. So we sent the engines, because the rest of it was going to New Zealand and the engine shoppers in California, it didn't make any sense to take them down there and send them back. So Jose Flores from Vintage V12s drove down from Tehachapi with his big trailer, and we popped the engines on the back of the truck. Off he went. So this is early 2014, and everything else went into the container.
So did you have to bust the airplane up or carve it
Well,
up?
by the time 2014 came around, it had been pretty well busted up.
Yeah.
And it was most of the metalwork had been stored in a container off-site, but the wings and remains of the fuselage were at Chino at that time. So we just gathered up everything we thought that was going to be of use to us, stripped everything else off, and stuck it in the box and sent it to New Zealand, which, by the way, gave the Ministry of Agriculture a bit of a shock when they opened the door and looked inside. Wow, really?
So this is
That's
2014?
Yeah, so this is in 2014.
So this all arrives except the engines, right? And what was the process then? What happened then?
Well, the woodwork part of it had already been kind of taken care of. Well, it hadn't started on this job, but the process of restoring the woodwork and building new fuselage and wings and what have you had already been perfected, and the process sorted out pretty much on the previous two that we'd done. So this is the third aeroplane that we've managed to do, sort of since the process of Mosquito restoration has taken place. We started that first one in 2005, and it didn't fly until 2012. So the first one was a 7-year project. The second one was a sort of 5-year project, and the second one is now flying in Seattle. And this one turned out to be 4 years. So we learned a lot about how to do it, and found a whole lot of the missing information that we needed and all that kind of stuff over the preceding, however many years that was. So the process was a bit more straightforward. But yeah, woodwork began, and trees were cut down and all that sort of stuff. Plywood manufactured. Yeah. And the reconstruction of the fuselage and wings takes place first. And while that's going on in the woodwork shop, we're getting on with overhauling all the components and preparing to kind of put it all together like a big jigsaw puzzle.
But you already had the molds, the jigs, you were ready because you had the experience with two earlier airplanes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why it's so much, a shorter calendar period anyway.
Right. So how many of these are still flying in the world?
I don't know. There's 3 basically here in the U.S. that are flying. There's one in Canada that can fly and has flown, but it hadn't been flown in a while.
Yeah.
That's what we've got here.
Yeah, hasn't flown since
Europe,
2015.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, there's nothing else anywhere else. So there's the 3 here in North America and 1 in Canada, yeah.
So as far as we know, there are just 4 in the world.
4. 3 actively flying.
Now there's one here at the museum.
Yeah, the one here at the EAA museum.
But it can't. I wouldn't fly it.
Yeah. So Sam, what are you hearing now? As you're the aviator here.
Well, I don't know it. I don't think I'm on.
Yeah.
Hello.
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 Hey, Ron? No, I'm talking to Ron and sound. Ron, can you hear me?
Hello?
Sam's mic isn't working. I'll repeat, yeah.
Initially, did the government contact Havilland to develop this airplane, or did Havilland have to develop it on their own and then convince the British government that they wanted it?
Yeah, the question from Sam is that originally, with this airplane, this design airplane, did de Havilland do it on their own and then sell it to the British government, or did the British government come to de Havilland and say, develop the airplane to these new specs?
Within these specifications.
Yeah, you're good.
In other words, how difficult was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what the process was at that time is that the Air Ministry, as they were known as in the UK, would put out a specification for an aeroplane. It might be a fighter, a bomber, or a liaison, whatever it might be. And the specification would say that we're looking for a bomber that'll, can cruise at 285 mile an hour and fly 1,200 miles and carry X number of pounds of bombs, etc. So a specification was issued for a light bomber. And de Havilland we're looking to get into the market, obviously, because there's a lot of airplanes being manufactured, and it's a good time for companies making airplanes if you can get an order. So the problem they had was that everybody had been telling the Air Ministry and everybody else that would listen that the metal airplanes were the way of the future, and the Spitfire and the Lancaster, all these other airplanes which were made out of metal were the way things were going to go. But their design was sort of a bit like turning back the clock as far as these military people were concerned, and they didn't want to know anything about it to start with. They rejected the offer from de Havilland right at that very first early stage, and in a lot of cases that would mean the end of it. If you don't get funding for a prototype, it doesn't happen. But de Havilland were building Tiger Moths and a whole lot of other, making money in other areas.
Mustang?
So...
Is that a Mustang?
Yeah.
Mustang.
Sound of freedom.
So de Havilland.
Yeah, so de Havilland decided that they had so much confidence in the design and the fact that they could meet the specification or exceed the specification that they would take a punt on building the prototype themselves without an order and without any funding from the government. So in an 11-month period, and this is quite incredible, in an 11-month period from being rejected, they had the prototype ready to demonstrate to the Air Ministry in the UK. Now, 11 months from a design from just a concept drawing on a piece of paper to drawing it all up, building it, having it ready, a completely new design, and then on top of that, not only was that quite a remarkable achievement in itself, they had no airfield where their design office and manufacturing prototype building place was based. It's a place called Salisbury Hall in St Albans, just about 25 miles by air north of London. And Hatfield, where the de Havilland factory was 5 miles away, but Salisbury Hall, where they built the prototype, had no airfield at all. So in this 11-month period, they draw up the airplane, build the prototype, pull it apart, put it on a truck, take it to Hatfield, put it back together again, and test fly it.
My gosh.
So, yeah, I mean, it must have been an amazing time for them. Oh, plus, while the bombs are raining down, of course, because now this is in 1940, and, shit's getting real. Anyway, they did a really, really fantastic job. The aeroplane exceeded all their expectations. It was faster than they expected it to be. Turned out to be lighter than they had planned. And when they demonstrated it to the British, even though they still had some problems, and there was a guy, Freeman, who kind of campaigned on their behalf with the Air Ministry to take this aeroplane on. They finally got it approved, and orders came in for a bunch of first production airplanes, and away they went.
How much of the ability to to go from paper to a flyable airplane was because it was basically made of wood. Did that cut down on the
yeah, I guess it would have.
building time?
You know, for the same sort of things I was suggested before, that you don't need a massive amount of tooling.
Yeah.
I mean, with the way the fuselage is built, you do have to have a mould. But one mould can make multiple aeroplanes because you know, it's not on the mould for very long. But for those that don't sort of realise the way the Mosquito's built, it's a lot like your normal model aeroplane might be. Fuselage is joined vertically down the top and bottom, so it comes together in two halves, just like a model aeroplane would. And so the mould is a male plug with slots in it, a little bit like a toast rack, to hold the 7 bulkheads. And then the plywood's laid over the outside of this male mould and held down with metal bands. So you do need to have a mould, and the two halves are eventually pulled off the mould and joined together. So they made a number of moulds, and some of them were made out of concrete. And away the production went. But because, you know, so many of the components were just built off a set of full-size plans and chopped up out of pieces of wood, it didn't take a lot of preparation to be ready to go into production.
In the mold situation, did the wood have to be made damp or wet in order to mold it or not?
Well, the fuselage is only made out of 1/16th of an inch thick plywood. So it's slightly over 1/2 an inch thick in total, the sandwich, but it's got 1/16th plywood on the inside, more or less 1/2 an inch of balsa wood or spruce laminated members, and then another layer of 1/16th inch balsa wood on the outside. And, you know, it's made in multiple pieces that are spliced together.
Right.
Scarfed together, rather. So it does sort of wrap around it pretty well.
Right.
And the nose, which has got the greatest amount of sort of shape in it, it's strip planked, if you like. So a bit like you might have seen, vintage boats have got beautiful mahogany strip planking in order to get the curve. Well, they did the same with the plywood on the nose. But yeah, sometimes you have to steam it. The leading edge of the wing, which is a tight radius, that's formed by steaming.
Right.
But yeah, generally dry.
Well, you know, you said that they were concerned about going back to wood, I guess because of the deterioration. Did they have any problems with the glue on that when they first started building it and they had to leave them outside? They couldn't be in a hangar?
Yeah, well, the original Mosquito was built from casein glue, which was a furniture manufacturing glue, which is a made from a milk byproduct. And while it's a good glue, you know, it's strong enough. It wasn't particularly waterproof, and so there was increasing issues associated with water getting into the glue joints and some glue failures. But then this idea of synthetic resin was developed at the same time, and the Mosquito was the first sort of mainstream use of synthetic glue, which at those days was a urea formaldehyde glue, which was superior to the casein, but still has got some water absorption issues that have prevented most airplanes from that era that were glued together with urea from still flying today. So yeah, when the airplane got into operation in the islands, like they operated them in Burma, and you know what it's like if you've ever been to the tropics. You know, every afternoon at 2 o'clock there's an enormous downpour. Well, the escape hatch on the Mosquito is a big square panel above your head that you can get out if you can't open the door. And because of the nature of it, it leaks water in a very heavy volume of rain, and the rear edge of it just happens to be right over the main spar of the wing, which is a bit unfortunate. So the water drips through and soaks into the main spar, and they did have some failures in Burma with that, but they figured out ways to mitigate that problem. But of course nowadays we don't use that type of glue, and the modern glue is sort of 100% waterproof, so we don't see any long-term issues with the glue any longer.
Right. Engines, I'm wondering about. I'm sitting looking up at these two engines that you said were the original engines.
Yeah.
What are they?
Well, they're Rolls-Royce 25s, so that's basically a single-stage Merlin. Basically the same motor as you see in an early Spitfire or a Hurricane or in a Lancaster bomber. So they made two versions of the Mosquito, or two engined versions, one with this motor, which is a sort of low-level engine, not highly supercharged, so it doesn't have an intercooler and only has a single-stage supercharger. And then they built the higher altitude ones for the long-range photo reconnaissance and bombers, and they have a two-stage engine with an intercooler, just like you would find in a Mustang. Right. When they built the aeroplane in Canada, they had a Packard in them, but the British-built ones all had Rolls-Royce engines. So Rolls-Royce Merlin 25, 1,610 horsepower.
Was there any difference between the three manufacturers?
Yeah, the airplanes that were built in Canada, they made some changes, I guess, from a supply perspective. They used Packard engines to start with, and they also used American designed instruments and electrical plugs and switches and things like that. So if you get in a Canadian-built one, it's got GE instruments and normal switches you might find in any other American airplane, and Canon plugs instead of breeze connectors. So yeah, differences in the electrical and instrumentation, but pretty much everything else was
How about quality
identical.
control? Was it about the same?
Well, I don't really know. We haven't noticed any difference between them. But then we have only seen a few handful of them.
Well, you mentioned inside that really it was like as far as a composite airplane, it was similar to the construction of a 777. Is that correct?
Well, the point I make quite often is that the way that the Mosquito was designed back in 1940, utilizing a sandwich skin construction where you've got a stressed member on the outside and inside, in this case plywood, and then a soft, lightweight medium in between to hold those two skins apart, which is exactly what modern composites are. This aeroplane was really the first production of use of that type of construction. And it resembles, a Dreamliner's construction far more than anything else has between World War II and now, in as far as mainstream production's concerned. This type of sandwich skin construction has become the way of the future, but it's taken 75 years to happen. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples of it out in the field with the home-built aeroplanes, of course, because they had the ability to make use of that. And all the composite stuff that's out there now really leans on the development and design of this aeroplane from all that time ago.
I'm looking between you two, and I realize the tail dragger.
Yes.
Right? How much does that affect your flying it in any way, shape, or form?
Well, you need a little tail wheel experience for this one. It does not have a locking tail wheel. So once you set it down, it can go either way. Now, you got to get used to the British brakes, because you displace the rudder and then you grab a handle to put the amount of brake that you want in to correct. So you're doing a lot once this thing gets on the ground. But it's really pretty tame. It's not a bad airplane. It's not like a 109 or anything like that that's liable to turn any direction at any time.
Sam, as you're listening to that about flying it, would you like to try to fly this airplane?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
What would he be dealing with? I mean, he's got 35,000 hours in lots of different airplanes. But
like I say,
you
have to be a pretty good tail wheel pilot to do this one. If you're not, you have to anticipate what's going to happen to you and get the feel of the brakes. And once you got that, it's just a tail wheel airplane. It doesn't have oleo struts in it, and it has no fluid, no air. They're pieces of rubber, and with the big balloon tires and everything, it lands soft. It's just as nice as you can. Yeah. So it's good, but with a tail wheel that doesn't lock, it can turn any direction at any time.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you three-point it or do you wheel end it?
You can three-point it. I usually wheel land it because that gives you positive control with the rudder to get set for the breaker ride that you're fixing to have. But it's, it's 100 knots over the fence.
What? Q&A? Yeah.
Right now we've got a little bit of time here for Q&A, some questions and answers. We have two people here with mics. If you'll wait till they bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Is it on? The P-38 Lightning had counter-rotating propellers. Why do you think de Havilland went with non-counter-rotating propellers on the Mosquito?
Well, the P-38 has a different tail on it than this does. Okay, that's what affected the P-38. This thing, believe it or not, you can, and it's in the manual. This is the way that they did it, and they figured it out. You set the brake, your hand brake, you hold it, you take the engines and you go to zero boost, which is basically 30 inches. So that gets the props up. Let go of it and go max to 14, and it stays straight.
Wow. Wow.
Next. Up here. Yes, sir.
What was the maintainability?
Hold it close to your mouth, please.
What was the maintainability of the plane during the war in terms of damage and repairability because it's wood?
Well, it's a fighter, it's a bomber. They did it all. That's the neat thing about the Mosquito, is it was multiple.
In terms of fixing bullet holes and damages because it's wood, was it harder and how would you go about fixing it, to patch the holes from impacts?
I didn't hear the first of that.
Did you ask, was it difficult to repair?
Yes, because of the wood.
Well,
bullet holes.
I don't know how difficult it was for them, actually. I guess you're not going to have moulded pieces of plywood ready to go on if you're at a field base, but trees pretty much go anywhere, so perhaps you could just go out and find yourself a bit of timber from any old where and slap it on. So I'm not really too sure how easy or difficult it was, but it was known by the people that operated to be the kind of airplane that would always get you back home, even though you might have suffered some terrible damage. And there's some wonderful pictures of airplanes making it back to base with huge chunks of wing blown off and enormous great holes in the rear fuselage. I think part of the reason why it was able to take a lot of battle damage is because it's truly a monocoque fuselage, and you could blow a big chunk of it out and you wouldn't take out a main member. There were in some cases, bullets would go through some part of your fuselage and the tail would come off, but on the Mosquito, I think because it's such a monocoque design that you could blow a big chunk of it out and it would still hold together. So it wasn't known by its crew as being a very robust airplane and one that was capable of getting you back home, pretty well.
And it flies really well on one engine. Your critical time, of course, just like any multi-engine takeoff, is right after takeoff. But if it's up and going and you feather it, clean it up, and everything, so they could limp home on one.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Could you comment on how stealthy it was, or what the radar signature looked like, say, compared to its contemporaries like a P-38?
I don't know.
Weren't you there?
Huh?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, I don't really know. I guess the propeller and engine is going to be your big problem. Doesn't matter what you make the airplane out of, the propeller and the engine is still going to be a pretty big part of it. And curiously enough, that even though it's a wooden airplane, it's also full of literally miles of copper bonding strip. So there was obviously an issue with static electricity build-up, and the company went to a lot of trouble to bond every piece of metalwork to every other piece of metalwork. So if you get an opportunity to look up inside the bomb bay or any part of it that's wooden,
and that's one of the neatest things on this airplane. Y'all need to look at it. Is the bonding and everything. It's absolutely perfect.
Yeah. There's copper strip varies from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch thick, depending on how many sort of components are connected to it, and it's all nailed on with a little brass brad. And so the whole aeroplane is literally covered in this, spaghetti of copper bonding strip, and that probably doesn't help with this radar signature. So, yeah, it's probably not as good as you think it's going to be. You sort of think because it's a wooden aeroplane, it might have been hard to pick up on radar, but the reality of it is it's full of wire as well, and that all just escapes through the timber just as easy as anything else. So I guess it probably wasn't as good as you might think it was.
One more over here.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
We know that it could outrun most fighters, and a New Zealand pilot operating out of Burma once wrote about being chased by Japanese fighters, and they just opened the taps a little bit and just went a little bit faster than the Japanese fighter. And he said eventually after about 1/4 of an hour you'd see a puff of smoke when the engine blew up and they were gone. But could you tell us, in its fully bombed up weight, how much it could carry in its full weight?
How much what?
How much bombs could it carry?
I don't know how many bombs it carried. It carried a whole lot of armament with the guns and everything, but I've never seen them count on the bombs that could be fit up in there.
This example came out at 14,666 pounds empty, and in the war they got them up to 22,500 odd pounds. So of course a lot of that's taken up with fuel and what have you, because it carried a lot of fuel. But the biggest bomb load it carried was a thing called a 4,000-pound. Yeah, it carried a 4,000-pound cookie bomb. They couldn't fit it in the... Probably the biggest shortcoming of the airplane was the size of the bomb bay. It, with all the power it had and the ultimate performance it had, you couldn't really fit much in there because it's quite small. So if you get an opportunity to have a look at Kermit Weeks's airplane down at the EAA Museum, you'll see that it's got a sort of swollen belly on it. And they moved the bomb bay doors down close to the ground and fattened it out so they could fit this 4,000-pound bomb they called a cookie, which kind of looks like 3 55-gallon drums joined together, this big, long, ugly barrel, and that weighed 4,000 pounds. So, that's quite a bomb load for an aeroplane like this with a tiny little 50-foot wingspan. And, they say that it carries the same bomb load as a B-17, but those sort of numbers are kind of not necessarily telling the real story. It could carry it, but it wouldn't go as far.
Yes, sir. One last question.
Yes, you hear stories about planes or remains of planes being found in strange places. I was just wondering, are there any rumors out there or stories that there's still some of these hidden places or could be out there in the jungles or somewhere? I'm not looking to buy one. I'm just curious if there's any more remaining to be restored.
Well, there wouldn't be much left as far as the wood. You would have metal parts maybe, and they'd be, depending on where it was. But finding something like that, it gets harder and harder every year.
Probably what you say is true. There is the opportunity for aeroplanes to be, discovered in different places. But I think the bigger the aeroplane gets, the less likelihood there is of being able to find one that nobody knows anything about. And then if it's made out of wood, well, then there's even less chance that it's still going to survive. So there may be airplanes out there that could still be discovered, and hopefully there are for a company like us, because that's what we need. But I doubt there'll be mosquitoes because, they're just too big to hide, and you can't leave them outside. They end up just falling on the ground.
Well, one last question in regard to that. The P-51s, there are people that are remanufacturing P-51s with just the data plate. Do you intend on doing that with a Mosquito?
Well,
you got all the molds.
It sounds like you're looking for one. Are you?
Yeah, really.
There's even with this airplane here and the amount of stuff that we had to start with, which was a considerable amount. It still takes in excess of 80,000 hours of work to restore it from an original project, and in anyone's terms, 80,000 hours is a lot of money. So if we were to start making everything, building new wheels and landing gear and engine mounts and all the other literally thousands of metal components, the price would just go so far out the roof that it wouldn't be practical. Yeah, it wouldn't be practical. It would be, you know, it's hugely expensive now, relatively speaking, and it's the idea of doing it from scratch. Don't think it's going to happen.
Thanks, both of you. We really appreciate your information and bringing your beautiful airplane here.
Yeah, thank Warren Denholm, Stuart Dawson, Warren Denholm. Thank you, gentlemen.